All right. Good afternoon, folks. So thank you all for joining CTAA's Small Urban Network Conference. It's exciting to see everyone, even if it's virtually. Hopefully next year we will be able to actually meet in Missoula. We definitely had a lot of fun activities planned, so we plan on keeping those in the schedule. We'll just have to wait a year to do it. But in the meantime, there is, of course, lots to talk about in the transit world, in the small urban network world. And so one of those is, of course, the financial situation that we all face. And so before we get started, I just want to give everyone a little bit of background on Zoom. So we are here in a meeting format instead of a webinar format. So that does mean that we can be more interactive than if this were a webinar. Everyone has been muted upon entry, just so that way we keep down on any background noise while people are presenting. But once it comes time for the Q&A, please feel free to send in questions through the chat box. So actually send those in through the chat box throughout the entire session. You don't have to wait. And so then this way we'll have questions lined up for our speakers. And so with that, then we'll call on people based on certain questions, and then you'll be able to feel free to unmute yourselves then. But until then, please keep yourself muted. And the way this session is set up is that we have 3 speakers, and then about half of the breakout will be set for Q&A. So there'll be lots of chance for our experts to answer questions. And so, with the ongoing pandemic, this has, of course, thrown everyone's financial situation into disarray. And the current state of transit funding in particular is interesting because, of course, local tax revenue and farebox recovery revenue and ridership have all declined, creating a certain challenge, but at the same time, the CARES Act funding that has come through Congress provides a different form of funding opportunity. So there's a lot to navigate going forward, and a lot to figure out. So we have some experts with a lot of insight into how to, or at least some insight into how to navigate this, and provide some experiential feedback and to answer anyone's questions. So considering I have only just created a paper household budget last year, I will pass this off to experts really quickly who actually know what they're doing. So first up, we will have Dave Harris, who is from the New Mexico Department of Transportation. Following Dave, we'll have Todd Butler from the Cache Valley Transit District in Utah, who has experience working with university town, and so that very industry-specific town or city focus. And then Chris Zeilinger, who you may have heard of from the Community Transportation Association of America. And Chris is currently trying to build a transit system, and so that presents its own unique challenges as well. So I will just pass this right off to Dave, who's going to start from the DOT perspective and talk about CARES Act funding as well. So I will stop sharing my screen, and Dave, it's on you.
All right. All right. Hello, everyone. Dave Harris, New Mexico DOT. Thanks to CTAA for hosting this and being an advocate for many of our transit agencies' needs. We always appreciate it. So I'm going to talk a little about just the CARES funding situation in the state of New Mexico. In general, we're probably this funding and the way it was administered by FTA, the general summary is that it really helped. It'll continue to help. And we're probably in a better, sorry, it's my dog hitting the cord. we're probably in a better situation than many other states with funding, thanks to the CARES Act. So New Mexico, transit in New Mexico, we're the 5th largest state by land area, so very large. Only 2.1 million people, and probably half that population is rural. Very large, very sparsely populated. However, we have a very transit-rich environment, considering that. We have commuter rail, which I'll show you, sort of runs, if you can see this, runs from Belen up to Santa Fe. Then we have a number of regional bus systems coming through into Albuquerque, into Santa Fe, from down south, El Paso to Las Cruces, some from Alamogordo into Las Cruces, and then even down here from Moriarty into Albuquerque. So a number of different regional and intercity bus systems, and then we have a large urban bus system in Albuquerque, a number of small urban bus systems. There are 4 small urban areas in the state, and then a number of rural transit systems. You know, here's a whole city in Roswell, Hobbs, Portales, and then a number scattered throughout, a number of demand responsive systems, but the pretty much every county in the state is served except 3 or 4, and some of these counties, like Baca County, has about 1,500 people. You can see Baca here, and that doesn't have any transit. So most of our counties are served by at least some sort of transit. And then underlying this whole system, we have rural transit, regional transit districts, which have referendum enabling legislation, and a couple of our regional transit districts are funded that way through a gross receipts tax that was approved. The last one that was approved was 2008 for a couple of the transit districts, and then extended in one of our other transit districts. They had a sunset and it got extended. So that's how very rich, the bottom line is sparsely populated, but all types of different transit except for ferry, and a very rich transit environment considering. Next. So we received $132 million in CARES Act funding statewide. That's almost like everyone else for the most part, and almost, it's a little less than 3 times the annual appropriation that the state would receive in general. In our large urban area, the city of Albuquerque, which runs the bus system, received over $27 million. And Rio Metro Regional Transit District received $52 million. So Rio Metro Regional Transit District operates a commuter rail, a 100-mile commuter rail, which the state owns, and the Transit and Rail Division, which I oversee, helps oversee and manage the assets. So they received a lot of money. Most of this money is for commuter rail and part of the formula for 5307 and 5337 that they received under CARES, and some of it is bus money. And another point I should make out is that under our governor and the public health emergency, we stopped service on our commuter rail. The governor just decided that the commuter rail itself would stop operating. And so our commuter rail hasn't operated in revenue service since March. Although we still have to run it because we have a positive train control deadline coming up, and we need to maintain the certification of the operators and staff on the train, and we need to keep the equipment in good working order, because if you don't run train equipment, things break with lack of use. So That's our large urban situation. Small urban, which I think Scott Bogren pointed out earlier, I think very accurately, and something we've been talking about for a long time, is that, you know, the small urbans, especially in the 5339 situation, formula funding annually, they seem to get the short end of the stick every year. And typically with 5339, they're splitting, you know, I'm splitting $1 million or a little more between 4 small urbans to split a quarter of a bus. So, but in this case, our 4 small urban areas received just about 16 million, which I think was very helpful to these areas to keep them running. The only anecdotal story I have to share with this is that one of those areas here, the city, you know, was reacting, you know, to the lack of gross receipts and lack of tourism coming in, which a lot of places have, and they were going to do a citywide furlough. So I got involved to a certain extent and expressed to them that Congress's intent was for transit systems to not furlough its employees, keep its employees for when, you know, the pandemic's over, they could be back up and running right away, or be running during it, and be taking necessary precautions during it. So, and, you know, you can't just furlough transit employees for, you know, 4 hours a week, right? It messes up your schedule. You know, it wreaks havoc. It's really something that's too difficult to be done for a small urban bus operator who runs fixed route service. So, you know, so Congress's intent was actualized in that manner, where they did furlough all of the city employees except for transit employees during this time. So 5311, we have 22 rural subrecipients. Like I said, half of the state is rural population. So in rural areas, 24 of the 29 rural counties are served. And then we also have Navajo Nation, Zuni, Laguna, and Wingate Pueblos. Most systems with fixed route went to demand response only in March through June. About 4 systems shut down services fully, and all systems are now operating at varying levels. Some are full service, some are still no fare, some are still demand response, but they're getting back into the swing of it. Although in New Mexico, we still have a public service health order where a lot of businesses are public emergency health emergency order, where a lot of businesses are still closed. State employees are still remotely working as well. So our average annual awards of everything federal and local combined, like I said, you know, we don't have any recurring transit funds that the state gives to locals. The locals match all the federal money. However, there is that regional transit district enabling legislation that allows jurisdictions to go out and get tax funds for transit purposes through a referendum. And you know, this year there are always some exceptions to that. This year we're providing $600,000 in capital that'll help match some of the capital costs. And in the past, the state has put in $1 million to pilot services that reach out to elderly, disabled children. That was last year, to run some pilot projects on that. And our average annual awards for 5339 are about $4 million a year. So we got in CARES Act about 3 times, 36.5 million. In CARES Act, we reserved about 10% of that as as allowable under state administration. We haven't spent that yet. We're reserving it to see if we need to continue assisting the 5311 transit agencies. But we put it in reserve for now and are holding it. So in FY20, this past year, we run on a federal fiscal year here. So we have August and September left, August and September left of our federal fiscal year. We programmed from March going forward about almost $13 million to cover 100% of administrative and operating expenses for all of our rural subrecipients. The total expended, and probably a few haven't sent in their invoices for July. We've billed about 5.6 million. So people are spending it. They're spending it on PPE. They're spending it on not furloughing staff, and so on and so forth. Typically, in a usual year, we have cost savings, which is the last bullet on this slide. We project that we'll have, of that 12.7, we'll have about 1.7 that'll be projected as cost savings. So that's money that's not spent. And we usually have, well, that's 15%. And we usually have about 8 to 9% cost savings every year. So there's always some money left over that we have to reprogram at the end of the year. So we project probably double in these pandemic times of, double the usual 8 or 9%. It's probably 15, 16% that we're projecting. So we'll have that money left over. And our plan was, for this upcoming year, we wanted to just give everyone a leg up. And throughout all this, we speak to our subrecipients and we say, hey, we're footing the bill, but we want you, and if you need our help, we're glad to do it and we're glad to assist, but we want you to reach out to your administrations and city, your boards, whatever they might be, and tell them, hey, we're helping out here, but when the time comes and this money runs out, or when your revenues pick up, we need you to, come back and not just say, well, we're just going to shut down, or, we hope you don't have to shut down. And, we want you to know that this is still something on the books for your administration to pick up, the local match. So, that's a concern. But our original plan for this year was we were going to pay all operations for the whole year. So about 16.7 million. And then we were, and anything that someone was awarded over what they received last year for 21, we're going to give them the money, but we want them to pay the local match because, if you want to go services beyond what you were doing before, we're going to use our regular 5311 for that, but we'll use CARES for your current award from 20, carrying it forward to 21. And an administrative we weren't going to pay was our plan. So that's the usual 80-20 match, and that was 2.8 million. So, but our current plan, looking at our cost savings and looking what our cost savings might be for 21, is the same plan we had this year. 100% of operations, except for anything over and above what your FY20 award was. And we're going to plan on programming. It's not finalized yet. So if you're from New Mexico and on this call, don't pop the champagne yet. We're planning on doing 100% for administration too. So the same we did for 20, we're going to do for 21. This pandemic is going longer than we thought. So we plan on 20 million in awards, CARES awards for 2021. So the way the money was administered by FTA, the quickness and rapidity of the grant award from FTA was great. It's just what we normally do, but more money, and made it easy for us to implement this, and it kept things simple, which I really applauded, and it looks like, you know, those are some of the same things that are going forward in new continuing resolutions or new transportation bills for next year. So we're happy about that. So at the end of this year, we're going to allocate or evaluate the cost savings from last year. And then we'll program the 2022 awards based on our cost savings, final cost savings from 20 and projected cost savings from 21. We think about 3.5 million will be left. So that'll be some additional funds to spread around. And then we also still have that 3.6 million of its state administration that will be remaining in reserve. So somewhere around $7 million we might have potentially for 2022. You know, I think we have, you know, our staff was really on it, and, you know, we understand our financing and budgeting really well. And it made it easy for us to, you know, really even, you know, on the back of a napkin, understand how long we can make this money last. And, you know, and the you know, the simple elegance, I think, of doing what we've, of FTA implementing what they've done before has made this a pretty easy, a pretty easy process for us overall, considering the circumstances, which I think, you know, helped us overall and helped our subrecipients in being able to understand and administer this with, you know, lack of red tape and lack of additional requirements than are already there. You know, our ridership, you know, unfortunately, I think our ridership was about to rebound, I believe. I think we hit before this pandemic hit, we were, I think, at the bottom of the trough, where we had every choice rider who wanted to ride and every dependent rider who wanted to ride, and people were choosing transit because it was the right choice for them, and it was starting to come up. You know, we're different, like I said, sparsely populated. We're in a state relatively where there isn't as much congestion as there is in larger metro areas. People tend not to pay for parking. So people, the big deciding factor here is always gas prices. That's really the big deciding factor. And gas has been $1.80 to $2 here a gallon for a while now. Maybe the highest I've seen in the past few years is $2.30. So, but I've been here when gas is $3.50, $4, and people flock to transit. So we just want to be ready in case gas prices go up. So we're not having, and, you know, and right now we're not having the capacity issues larger metro areas have. So we're fortunate with that, but, you know, we're always thinking ahead, and we're trying to get ahead of what the next steps might be when capacity might be pressuring social distancing and the other health measures we want to sort of keep on transit. So with that, I think we're moving on. Do I turn it back to Andrew, or are we going to Todd?
Just real quick, I'll thank you very much, Dave. So that is just very interesting to see what's happening at the state level. And so now, Todd, at the agency level, if you would like to share what you guys are doing and what you've learned from this so far.
You bet. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Andrew. So let's get this going here. So just a little bit about Cache Valley Transit. So we provide service to 11 cities in Utah, 2 cities in Idaho. We do a combination of commuter service, fixed routes, paratransit, and then we have a mileage reimbursement program for some of our very rural areas to reimburse volunteer drivers for medical and essential shopping trips. We serve about 125,000 in population, and we are home of Utah State University. Go Aggies. There's about 20,000 students on campus pre-COVID. We'll talk about what post-COVID looks, or in COVID looks like. Our funding sources really are dedicated sales tax for transit, some small funding from advertising, and then we have a contract to provide the service up in Idaho that we have some funding from. And then one thing that we have always been zero fare since we started service in 1992. That's a community supported philosophy. And we'll kind of talk about how that relates to COVID as well. So some key takeaways for this is preparing for and responding to the COVID crisis, and then how we're using the COVID crisis to take advantage of opportunities that we believe lie ahead of us. So just real quick, definition of the crisis, a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger, or a time when difficult and important decisions must be made. And I would just encourage you that I think for us, and hopefully you'll see through the presentation, a lot of those key decisions were made prior to the crisis. And I think for us, that's been hugely successful. A lot of that came out of the 2008, 2009 Great Recession. We learned a lot through that crisis, and we realized there were a lot of things that we needed to change as an organization to prepare us for the next crisis. And whether that's a government shutdown, whether that's a financial turndown, whatever that is, I think the decisions that you make prior to that situation really impact you. And so even though we're in the midst of this COVID situation right now, I would encourage you to be looking at opportunities to make decisions for the future. So one of the things that was really key for us is this decision with our governing body. What is the service that we provide, and what's the cost we're willing to pay for those services? And those of you that operate systems, you understand this discussion of, are we providing coverage or are we chasing ridership, right? And those are kind of mutually exclusive. I mean, if especially in a university town, if we're chasing ridership, I can put a whole lot of service to the university and still have demand, but I can just have our ridership just grow. Just to give you an idea, because we're zero fare, we provide somewhere between 1.6 and 2.1 million trips a year. And so the service is highly utilized. But our board also, we were getting ready. We actually implemented a brand new service in January of this year, a new connector circulator route that connected the university to the major shopping destinations. And so in the summer and fall of last year, we really were having this discussion of what is it that we provide service, or who do we provide service for? And our board really came down on, look, our primary goal is going to be to provide service for those with transportation barriers. Either they have disabilities, they have no ability to have other transportation opportunities, whether financial or they don't have a license, whatever the case might be. We're going to focus on that group, and then let's make sure that that service that we're providing is top notch, so that we will attract folks that are choice riders. And so I think that was really critical as we went into COVID for us in dealing with that. Part of what we do every year is then develop budget goals that are adopted by our board that meet that definition. And so it really helps us to communicate not only to our board, but to the public, what we're trying to accomplish and how we're trying to do that. And that lets the board really determine at what cost are we willing to do that. And again, as we get into COVID, I'll explain why that was very helpful. And then, I think for us, it's very important that we're strategic with our funding, meaning that we're looking at the near term, what is it we're going to accomplish this next fiscal year, but what are we accomplishing in 5 years, 10 years, and lining up funding for those things, and making sure that we're strategic in how we do that, the timing of which we're drawing down our funds, the amount of fund balance we carry through. And so again, we'll talk about that. And then out of the 2008-9 recession, we recognized we didn't have some financial tools in place to deal with financial challenging times. And so we developed those, worked with our board, with the public, got those in place, and we implemented those through this COVID situation. And then another key thing is working with the elected officials at all levels, local, state, national, to develop the various funding streams that we have. And I kind of talk about the process we've gone through in doing that. And all of those things, I think, have been critical in us being successful through this COVID situation. So first of all, when it came time, our governor declared a stay-at-home order, and so for quite some time, folks were told to stay at home. He said that anyone 60 and older was at high risk, and they needed to not be out in the public. And so because of that, we made the decision that we put anyone that was 60 and over that was employed by us, we sent them home with pay. And that lasted 30 days that we put them at home for health reasons. And so because of that, we had to reduce our service by 35%. And so I'll talk about how we went about making those decisions. But it was critical in that time of red with the stay-at-home order. We saw that really what the board had decided, we're there for folks that don't have any other options. And we told people, don't use the system unless it's an essential trip and unless it's, really your only option. But we saw that there still is this core group of our community that is the case. And so I think this has been a really good opportunity for us to go back to our board and back to the public and really talk about our impact beyond ridership. And so we're really having that discussion right now of that this isn't just about ridership. This is about economic benefit. This is about people retaining employment. This is about people performing essential duties to the community. And this has been a really good discussion. And I think it's really helped our community to even more embrace public transit. Even though they may not choose to use the service, they still support the tax for it. And so I think it's been good that way. And again, then we tie back to our budget goals when it comes to what do we do as far as how are we going to manage what services we continue to operate during this pandemic. Those budget goals are a critical piece for us going back and working with our board because, it's challenging. I mean, when you start to have people, members of the public that may raise a question or express a concern, sometimes people can be reactionary. And we found the budget goals and these key services that we're to provide are great tools to help support our board in saying, hey, let's calm the fears. Let's be a point of good information. What information do we need to put out to the public? How can we portray that so that they'll understand what it is we're trying to do? And then utilizing the tools that we've made. So going back to the 2008-9 crisis, at that time, when financial things really turned south, we developed a actual toolbox of service standards. These are the standards that we would say a route needs to maintain in order to continue to be successful. If it's not, we may need to modify the route or do something different. And so from those service standards, if a route was below that standard, we'd put it on watch. And so we developed also an actual toolbox of if funding dried up, if we had to reduce our funding by 50%, how would we shut down service? What are the key elements? And so we had identified specifically by route our priorities for shutting down service. And then we update that every year. We look at that again and we go back and we analyze our ridership. We analyze the people that are riding the bus. And we look at that and we say, okay, is this still current or do we need to update that? So when it came time that we had to send the 60 and older group home, we had to shut service down. We had to reduce service by 35%. We immediately went to that toolbox. It was a fairly easy discussion with our board. We walked through the toolbox. We said, hey, this is something we look at every year. Here's our recommendation. The board supported the recommendation. And there was really not significant impact to our ridership because many of these things that we were shutting down were peak service additions, so where we were increasing frequency or later evening service where there wasn't a lot of ridership. And so it was a very effective tool in doing that. One of the other tools that we had implemented after the Great Recession was this tool of fund balance, of carrying over in our fund balance a minimum of 6 months, and we try to keep at least a year worth of operating money, so that if any time there's this financial shutdown or there's this decrease in revenues, we have time to make thoughtful decisions time to things play out a little bit, to see how it goes, and we're not worried. And so we're able to communicate to the public. Service is still going to continue to operate. We're still going to be in place. That 35% reduction in service wasn't financial, it was staffing. That's the reason we had to do that reduction. It was from a staffing perspective. And so as soon as the governor lifted that and changed that to 65 and older, and there was more information, as you all know, I mean, in the early days of this, things were very fluid. Things changed day to day. But as things started we established a new baseline of what things were. And the governor said 65 and older is high risk. We brought everyone back. We put in, PPE. We increased our cleaning. We did all of those things that we felt now it was safe. We went back up to full service, and we've been back up to full service since then. Because again, our goal is not necessarily ridership, but making sure we're providing service to those that need it. And from a financial standpoint, we know we have those revenues in place. And so even prior to CARES, we were not worried financially because of that fund balance that we had put in place. And so once CARES came in, then it was like, okay, great. Now we have some additional funding. Let's start having the discussion. How are we going to use this? What's our strategic plan? And so it really allows us to do it from a place of, almost like we would any time rather than a place of crisis. And so I really encourage you to, if you can find ways to set something in place like that, that's really a safety mechanism. We found it extremely helpful for what we've been doing in managing this. The other part of that is right now, and I always believe the crisis is the best time for you to really sit back and be taking notes, be observing, listening to what's going on, and what are things that you're missing that you weren't before. And so we've had many things that have come up where we're like, oh, is that really necessary? Is that something we really need to keep doing, or is that just something we're doing because we've always done it that way? And so we're not making decisions on those things now, but we are definitely taking notes about those things and saying, okay, when we get out of this, when we get a new baseline, and that's really what we're waiting for, right? Is what does post-COVID look like? Then what do we look at implementing? So talking about that, what does the future look like? I think, for us, we're really grateful to CTAA for being as engaged as they are. And always a shout out to Scott and the staff. I mean, they've been a great resource of best practices, of creating forums where we can talk to one another and gain from each other's knowledge. And so I think that's always a great source for us that we turn to. One of the things that we're looking at is identifying services that really aren't accomplishing that goal post-COVID. So we've been talking with employers. We've been talking with the university, obviously. 20,000 students. They're our largest employer in the Valley. They're also our largest destination because of employment, but also because of the student body. Well, we're hearing a lot about change. We have some significant employers in the Valley that are saying, you know what, we found that our productivity has actually gone up since we've been having people work from home. We're probably only going to bring back 20% of our workforce. The other are going to just work from home. Well, that's a huge impact on traffic, on our demand for transit. The university, we've been anxiously engaged in talking with them. Currently, all of their student housing is full. However, they're going to do 100% online classes if people want to do that. And we just found out today they require face coverings on every building at the university, and they're not opening up their recreation centers. They're not allowing their food vendors to supply food. I mean, really, essentially everything that a college student would go to college for, to be on campus for, the social interaction, all of that, it's kind of shut down. And so we're looking at, well, that may really impact people's desire to come back to campus. They're probably just going to go online. We're hearing that the university's looking at doing major furloughs. They're buying people out of their retirement to retire early. And so we're again, we want to be patient. We don't want to react too quickly, but we're looking at that our whole world may be changing here in our Valley with regards to where our demand lies. So one of the things we're looking at is, what's that look like as far as the fixed routes? We already had some fixed routes that really we're, transporting not very many people. And so we're looking at, does maybe on-demand transit there with technology make a better fit where, we're not providing service into that community unless the demand's there. So a general public dial ride with technology, does that make sense? And so we're looking at services that we haven't looked at previously that I think we were already starting to look at, but COVID's just made that happen more quickly. And so I think that's something we're going to be looking at. We still know there's going to be this urban core that we service that's going to be fixed out. There's still going to be this commuter service that we know that will have still a core group of people. But some of these other things, we're going to have to be making some changes. One of the other thing is to continue to engage your board, elected officials, and public on delivering new service opportunities. One of the things I failed to mention back in responding to the COVID crisis is one of the things that really helped us with this COVID situation with the revenues was that, over the past 5 years, we have been working with our state legislature. When I say we, us and some of the larger transit systems, some of the cities and various entities on, because we're funded with sales tax, on getting us the internet sales tax. And so our state worked with Amazon and some other internet providers and got sales tax on those internet sales, where previously our state did not have that. And so during this time, our actual revenues right now are up about 20% over last year. And about half of that increase is internet sales. So again, when the stay-at-home order was in place, the people weren't shopping at the local stores. They were shopping online at Amazon, at Walmart, and those things. And we've definitely seen that impact. And so the internet sales tax has only been in place for 2 years. And so we are, again, that was that work that was done prior to this situation that's really paying off now. Now, we're still communicating to our board and to our elected officials at this point that, look, we see, given if the unemployment, the $600 went away, if that doesn't come back, once stimulus stops happening, we're just watching unemployment numbers, that's starting to climb, people not being able to pay their rent. We still do worry that there is a place out there in the future where the financial situation will become more dire. And so again, we're looking at that and planning for that and saying, okay, how can we use the CARES money to the best of our ability? What can we do? What do we need to do with our fund balance? And so we're continuing to have those discussions. Also in this situation, one thing that I found hugely successful is looking for partners that are willing to help on projects. So just prior to COVID, again, the university being our largest destination, we went right through the heart of campus, and we had students, that they just walk across the lane where the bus is going. And from a standpoint of safety, we would always have near misses there. And so we actually partnered with the university to put in a controlled light that would stop the pedestrian traffic. And we tied it to technology. So when the bus would get in a certain proximity, the light would change, give priority to the bus. But really the way that came about was us having some seed money and saying, look, we've got this money out here that we're willing to put towards this project if you'll do that. And that really made that happen. And since then, we've got another bus stop that's on a 4-lane or a 5-lane divided highway that we know is going to be hugely successful for the university. And so again, we went to the university and said that we can contribute this much if we can get this stop in place. And the university is paying 70% of the cost, and we're paying 30%. So it's a huge thing. We just recently had our county is looking to get some planning dollars, and they were wanting some planning dollars for trails. And so we partnered with them, and we're doing a first mile, last mile trail project where we're putting in a small amount for a match on this project. And then we feel like we're going to be successful in getting a pretty significant planning grant that would allow us to really identify where our infrastructure needs for connections to transit. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in the midst of this crisis, but it's really that prep work up front, and then being open to, how can we be a resource? Obviously, we want to tie our resources to transit-related projects, but I think there's opportunities for us to leverage those dollars that will help us get those projects done. And what it's done for us is really help the community see that we are a resource. It's allowed cities, elected officials to see we are a resource to help move their projects along as well. And it's just garnered support for us, and the community sees us as essential. Now, the other thing I will say is that's unique to us is because we're zero fare, we don't deal with that fare box revenue loss. And again, that may not be the right situation for every entity. It is for us. And like I said, it's a community-based thing. When we survey our voters, we have over 80% approval rating by our voters, and most of these people, don't ride the bus, use the system. We have a 75% approval rate of our zero fare. So that's clearly a community value here, that people want to take care of those that don't have other options. So that's kind of been what that's done for us. Just last little thought here, the turning point of any crisis is when a major or an important change takes place, indicating either recovery or death. And I really think as leaders of organizations, that's really what we're here to do. We're here to help shape that change, right? I mean, it's not all in our control, but we're here to help shape that. How do we influence that? And it's how we act and engage others, I think, that determines that, how our organization is viewed and supported. Much of what we've been dealing with has really been the upfront work. It was years in the making that's helped us to manage this situation successfully, and look for opportunities going forward. So thank you for the opportunity, and we'll turn it over to Chris.
All right. Thank you, Todd. Lots of interesting information in there. And Chris, you're up.
All right, let's see here. I am in the process of bringing up a slideshow, but as I'm in the process of doing that, I will say just a couple things to get us started. Okay, well, first of all, I'm going to say I'm having a little technical glitch at my end, Andrew. So if you can find my slides and you can run them for me, that'd be great. And if not, I can just talk through it because they weren't that critical. I will give a little bit of backstory, and that is 15 months ago, the transit system, just a couple hours away from Todd in Idaho Falls, stopped operations. And that was, thanks very much, Andrew. Okay, so what happened then, I mean, I could go on at great length about a lot of topics there, but the Idaho Transportation Department, after a lot of urging from city leaders in Idaho Falls, Idaho Transportation Department basically hired CTAA to work with folks at the state and local level to basically bring transit back to the city of Idaho Falls, which is part of what I've been doing since March. Now, when that happened, there was a bit of a coronavirus concern out there. But when we entered into this agreement with the state of Idaho in the end of February, that was the end of February. Times were a little bit different. So since then, we've been doing a lot of work, and I could go on in a lot of different directions, but what I wanted to do today was talk through the financing angle of that, because it's kind of an interesting case study in how we look at this stuff. So first, if we can go on to my first little slide there, let's just do a quick reminder about the non-federal share of transit funding in normal times. We're not in normal times, but let's think about normal times, because what I realized was, and this echoes much of what you've heard from Todd and from Dave, was that in any case, for there to be sustainable transit in a place like Idaho Falls, which, as Todd can tell you, because it's just up the road from his backyard, 60 some odd thousand people, kind of a slightly sprawly place, challenging environment to operate an efficient transit system in, but they wanted to do one. We needed to make sure that it was going to be sustainable. So the driving force from day one has been what can be generated locally that then can be used to leverage federal transit funds, because Idaho, like a lot of states with primarily rural populations, has very little state money that they put into transit. It's basically local generated funds and state. So we had to think about all the basic things. We had to think about, is there going to be fair collection? And if so, what's that going to represent? Is there going to be money, funds coming in from advertising revenues or from business sponsorships or that kind of stuff, which again, typically is not a huge part of a transit budget, but can be non-trivial. Are there going to be service contracts? Are there going to be outside grants? Are there going to be other arrangements to kind of help supplement it? I will just offer, I don't want to talk about why the system that had been there ceased operation, except I will mention that part of what led to that was that there was an over-reliance on Medicaid. So they really wanted to be sure that we're not putting all our eggs in one basket that then can be yanked out from under us. And then there's the question of what can the public sector provide for its share of support for the transit program. So really, I kind of honed in on that, but I will circle back to some of the non-public sector elements of how to finance a smaller urban transit system, and then that'll be a kind of a nice way to wrap up my part of this presentation. So let's kind of take a quick look at how do local governments get the money to the public sector funds to help pay for transit. So let's go on to the next slide. So there's a mixture of things. You've heard about a couple of these already from Todd and from Dave. Sales taxes, or at the state level, you could dedicate a portion of gasoline taxes. That's how it's done in California, or other excise taxes, which is basically taxing consumption. That's great. There's also some creative things that happen in some states, which is always fun to hear about, especially when it generates revenue. It's not so fun to hear when it doesn't generate money. There's lodging taxes that are used in some places. Arkansas collects a tax on rental cars so that when people fly into Arkansas, back in the days when people flew, and rented cars back in the days when people would rent a car, the Arkansas Transportation Department would get a sliver of funds to help support the transit budget. Gaming is a source of revenue. In New Jersey, the local transit systems are supported through some casino revenues. Pennsylvania uses about, I think, a big portion, it might even be half of their lottery proceeds to help pay for public transit in rural Pennsylvania. So, so there's a lot of these consumption-based taxes that are out there. There's income or payroll taxes, for instance. First of all, for general government funds, income taxes in the states that have an income tax, huge share of the revenue, so it's important to think about that. And I'll get back to that point in just a second here. And there's a few places. Oregon springs to mind where there's a statewide, if I remember right, payroll tax, which is like a form of income tax that's dedicated to public transit. And then property taxes. There's places all over the country, but what always springs to my mind is Michigan, where most of the local transit units of government with transit programs basically have the authority to do a property tax millage, a dedicated share of property tax, goes straight into transit, has to be renewed by the voters every few years. So it's a share of property taxes. So some of this then reflects into how is local government doing in its economic health? And is any portion of these tax revenues dedicated to transit specifically? In some cases, like you heard, the transit districts in New Mexico that Dave mentioned can have a dedicated funding stream based on gross receipts, a form of sort of like a sales tax. Or Todd's system supported also by a sales tax. So in some cases, it goes straight to the transit system. In other cases, it provides funding for general government stuff. What I'm working with in Idaho Falls, for instance, there's no taxing district there that collects transit taxes, but the state is gets from the state its share of sales taxes, plus it's, a lot of special purpose things are being funded through property taxes. I will, as a side note, say that it is always interesting to see what are the mechanisms for doing major capital finance. I'm not going to go down that particular alley because that would take up a whole separate session just in and of itself. But that is kind of interesting to see. But let's think about these tax receipts. And I will preface that by saying that what I've been seeing nationwide is that state and local governments on average are having to slash their current budgets, not next year's budgets, budgets right now, budgets of a fiscal year that they're already midway through, on average by between 25 and 30%. That's huge. Some of you might be, if you're collecting sales tax revenues, you'll see that some of that might be also reflected in what's happening for transit systems that have dedicated sales taxes. So anyway, but that's big. It's like trying to figure out, what does that mean for local government or state government? And B, what the heck does that mean for transit? So let's look at our next slide. So first of all, let's think about what actually happens when the economy goes south. Now, we're all hoping that this pandemic and an economic downturn does start to come back up. You know, I'm not an economist. I'm not a politician. I don't really pretend to be either one of those things. So I don't know when the economy is going to come back, but we hope it rebounds pretty quickly. But let's look to see what happens when the economy does go down. First of all these things that are taxing discretionary activities, they bottom out almost immediately. If people aren't buying stuff, sales taxes aren't being collected. If people aren't buying gasoline, fuel taxes aren't being collected. Let's remember that in many states, as well as at the federal level, most of the federal funds for surface transportation, including taxes, come from a federal and state motor fuel excise taxes. So if people aren't buying gas, that's going to affect the future big picture of how much money is there for transit. But even things like lodging, restaurants, all these things that tend to be part of how an economy runs, that's already hit a bottom point and is starting slowly to come back up. People are starting to shop more than they used to. They're starting to, one can debate the public health wisdom of this or not. I don't want to go there, but people are going to restaurants more. Eventually people just out of necessity are starting to travel more. So see, these things are starting to come back up. But if the economy doesn't really, if folks don't get back to work in a meaningful fashion, eventually income tax collections are going to go down, as well as taxes on major capital stuff. Right now, there's been a surprising boom in housing purchases. I don't understand that, but it shows that there are still some things that haven't bottomed out. Major capital purchases, people are still buying cars. People are taking advantage of low interest rates to do purchasing, that if they've got the money, they're making major purchases. But if the downturn persists, those will go down. More particularly, income taxes, it'll be interesting next year to see what actually happens on income tax collections. That will affect a lot of what happens at state governments and states that have an income tax. It'll affect at the federal level, income tax collections. There'll be a lot there going on there. So those could go down there. Now, the real danger sign is if property tax collections go down. This is all this doom and gloom stuff. This is great. It's so much fun to explore the doom and gloom of transportation and public finance. The best case scenario is that people default on their property tax bills, but the assessed value doesn't go down. It means that there's isolated cases where people aren't paying their bills, but still they're being assessed taxes. The worst case scenario, and I hope our country doesn't get there, is that eventually assessed valuations actually go down there. That's when the actual value of what's being taxed starts to shrink, and therefore it's harder and harder to collect revenues on it because there's just not a tax base to collect. So one of the things that I was looking at in Idaho Falls, and those of you that have been in some of my transit management classes have heard me say this in classes, is it's really important for us as transit people to know what the state of our tax base in our area is. Idaho Falls, just to get back to particulars, happens to be in a relatively sweet spot. They're not, it's not a booming economy, but they haven't been affected as badly by the current downturn as a lot of things. There's a big federal presence there because of a major national energy lab. B, the economy, aside from the lab, basically revolves around agricultural industry, and people, despite the pictures, actually there's this great media spot a while back of a huge pile of potatoes in eastern Idaho. That was right near Idaho Falls. That were going unsold, but by and large, ag production still goes on because people still need to eat. So the economy's not doing too bad. I was talking with the mayor of Idaho Falls a few weeks ago, and she was saying that the only downturn that they've really seen is a loss of employment and activity around travel, because people go up and down Interstate 15, and a sad but not, on the big scheme of things, huge loss to the community in terms of lost cultural jobs, arts and entertainment types of things. That money is just ain't there at all. But by and large, the economy in Idaho Falls is going bad. Not a huge problem with unemployment. They've been relatively COVID-free. They've had, like every place, they've had a handful of deaths and a few hundred cases, but it's not a bad situation from that angle. So their tax base is actually pretty solid. And so we really ended up looking at kind of like, well, what can we do with this? How do we finance this? So let's go on to my next slide. So we're thinking about making sure that if we bring transit back to Idaho Falls, that it's got to be recession-proof, because we don't know how long it's going to be before the economy is booming, even in eastern Idaho. So there's a few things we've been doing. And this gets back to some of the points that you've heard very well expressed by Dave and by Todd. One is diversify the funding stream. I mentioned as my little aside there that dependence on Medicaid as the sole source of revenue contributed to the loss of the previous transit system. So it really needs to be diversified. So one of the things that I did, for example, was I did look at the CARES Act and pointed out not the transit stuff, but I looked at the other things. The mayor of Idaho Falls and city council are kind of at loggerheads with the state of Idaho to see that the CARES Act funds for state and local governments, some of that actually goes to Idaho Falls. They want that. They're hoping they get a reasonable share of what local governments in Idaho need out of that. So that's one thing, because they need money that they then can turn back into helping pay for a transit program. Secondly, I pointed out that the city got a huge chunk of change in community development block grant supplements under the CARES Act. They got the local area agency on aging got a huge supplement of funding for senior services under the CARES Act. And these things actually make a difference. There's food nutrition funds under the CARES Act that are actually going into the area. So I said, all right, so there's money coming in there, and part of the transit job is to see that everything is going to be working out well. I don't want transit to be greedily grabbing up other people's money, but let's look at the funding base and make sure it's diversified. Also realized that even with uncertainty in the economy, that there were businesses in Idaho Falls that wanted to see transit and were willing to help pay for it. Willing to pay for it either through advertising or sponsorships, willing to help pay for it through helping purchase buses if it gets to that point, that they really were willing to kick in there. So we really tried to say, even though there's 100% federal funds out there, let's not assume that everything's going to be 100% federally funded. Let's see, what are we all willing to kick in there? So that was the one thing, diversify the funding streams. I invented a term that I think applies to what you heard Dave describe, many of the systems in New Mexico doing, what you heard Todd describe, what they've been doing in Cache Valley, which is operational elasticity, being able to shrink or expand or morph your operating model to fit your available resources. In other words, if you're running a 7-route fixed route bus service on 20-minute headways, maybe you don't always do that because the demand isn't there or the funding isn't there. Make it elastic. Either do different modes of service or even just do simple stuff like changing headways if you really feel like you need to do scheduled fixed route service or things like that. But basically introduce some elasticities. For example, again, getting back to my Idaho Falls case, which we're far from operational, so everything I say is very speculative right now, is that we're assuming a limited scope fixed route bus service with citywide demand response, both for paratransit needs as well as for the fact that there's just places that have noticeable transit demand, but would never in a million years make operational sense for traditional fixed route bus service. And no one wanted to go out on a limb and try anything that was too rocket science-y in terms of mobility on demand. That was like, no. They wanted tried and true models. So, but still we said, all right, we can pay for a lot of stuff through the state with using CARES Act, but what's going to be sustainable after that? So we're looking at things that can be shrunk up. I just made a new phrase there. Expanded or contracted to fit available resources and what makes operational sense. We really also said, let's make a solid business case. When I wasn't looking at financing, I was looking at who needs transit in Idaho Falls and why, and who wants there to be transit in Idaho Falls and why. And we realized that by and large, what people wanted to see was transit for seniors and transit for low-income households and mobility for people with disabilities. And if we focused on those three categories, that, we didn't try anything about luring people out of their cars because, like in so much of the Rocky Mountain West, roads are wide and parking is cheap. Free, actually. So let's not try to lure people out of their cars unless they actually want to. Let's look at the folks that really don't have a choice. And everyone I talked to in Idaho Falls was totally on board with that, regardless of where they were at on the fiscal conservative spectrum, where they were at on their political spectrum, where they were at on any of these things. Everyone agreed we have to have something for people who don't have a car, people who can't drive themselves. And they recognized that that was necessary. So we're building a case around that. And then that will then get to the final point there of saying, all right, how then do we make sure that this is a viable system so that we can demonstrate, all right, key concern in Idaho Falls is if the economy stays south for too long there, people will start losing jobs because they won't be able to afford to drive the car that they already have there. So let's have an option that will keep people employed or find them alternative forms of employment, because there are still large jobs in Idaho Falls to be had for folks that can get to them. And let's just make sure that transit is seen as part of the mix for economic vitality. Challenging element there is to weave transit in the local economy rather than looking at, as would be the easy thing when we're talking elderly, disabled, and low-income houses, weaving transit with social service delivery. So we're really saying, how does this fit into the economic fabric of Eastern Idaho, Idaho Falls in particular? So we're really looking at that business case there to say, all right, what is going to make sense? So what are we doing with that? We've got the city, even though they've not had transit for 15 months, the city continues to budget funds for the local share of a 5307 program that hasn't even existed for over a year, because they see the necessity. The city is committed to do that because they know that if they started to say, oh, well, we don't have transit here, why do we need to budget for it? The moment it's pulled out of the city budget, it's going to be really, really hard to put it back in. So they've made sure that even if it's just like a placeholder, it's about half of what they used to contribute, but it's something. So they've kept that in place. We've got businesses that, again, even though there hasn't been transit in Idaho Falls for 15 months, and it's going to be probably another, I don't know, many more months before transit comes back there. But businesses already budgeting for sponsorships, for bus wraps, for bus shelters, for that kind of stuff that they will sponsor. And so we're looking at that. We're even looking at things like saying, all right, how can the CARES Act is 100% federal funds, but that means there still can be a non-federal share if they need to. So if we need to make sure that the city's money is spent so it's not a use it or lose it type of thing, fine, we'll find a way to spend the city's funds. We're also looking at long-term stuff and spend out rates of our CARES Act funds available until expended, unless Congress sees money that hasn't been obligated and draws it back, and 5307 funds that have a 6-year period of availability but have a local match requirement. Although we're certainly hoping that, as Scott had mentioned at the intro session this morning, that it'd be really nice if for the next year or two, future formula funds came at 100% federal share. But that'd be nice, but we're not counting on that in Idaho Falls. We're saying, what can we afford to match locally? And then how do we make it all work there? So it's a fun example of stuff there. We've already got the senior program is desperately eager for transit to come back up there so they can basically do bulk purchase of mobility from a new transit program. We've already got the hospital district is interested in seeing transit resumed. We've got businesses that says we are eager to see transit resumed so that we can, if there's a fare payment, we'll help pay for fares. If there's not, we'll find other ways to sponsor so that we can have employees that are getting to and from our jobs. There's some urban revitalization districts that want transit to be part of that, so that that can be part of how some currently distressed parts of the city of Idaho Falls can be revitalized with transit as part of the revitalization. So that's kind of where we're at on that stuff. So in all of that, as you've heard from Todd, as you heard from Dave, the pandemic is a crisis. Don't get me wrong, we've got more people dying over this disease than any other cause of death in our country right now. It is not a happy thing. But there is, in all of that, a chance to kind of stop and look and listen and rethink what we're doing. The final thing I'll leave us with is looking at the question of utilization, because to have buses that no longer can have every seat full for public health reasons creates kind of an interesting resourcing challenge. to look at transporting seniors or other folks that are kind of at health risk or compromised situations at a time of COVID, and is a challenging thing there. So how to make all these pieces work, again, is an interesting part of the mix there. Part of what we're doing in Idaho Falls is saying, all right, what will we have to do to make sure that people actually feel like that it's an attractive idea to get on whatever this bus is going to look like and ride this bus to the places they need to go. So those were kind of my thoughts. I think we'll do now is kind of turn things over to the chat box and have Andrew moderate that so that questions can be discussed among all three of our panelists, as well as anyone else who happens to want to chat, because we are in kind of an open chat format.
So unfortunately, we are running a little short on time. But one thing I will do is I'm going to drop a few links into the chat box. So there are a few more materials that we have come up with at CTAA that we think will be very useful for everyone. So keep an eye out on that in just now. And then also, if anyone does have a question, please feel free to send that into the chat box. And then also I'm going to share my screen, which has everyone's contact information. There we go. And while we wait for any potential questions, I'm also going to drop a link into the chat box about our next session, which is it's another coffee chat, this time with GMV Synchromatics, and I can't find the link, but I will in a second.
While Andrew's doing that, I know that Bill from Manchester had asked earlier about the challenge of revenue substitution, which is my nice way of saying that places that entities, whether it's government or private nonprofits that had been helping support transit, saw that transit was getting 100% funding under the CARES Act, says, oh, great, we don't have to pay for that anymore. And so I think one of our challenges is to say, wait a minute, that 100% CARES Act funding, that was for a crisis. And a lot of this thing is to be forward thinking in terms of how you talk about what is it we're going to be operating a year from now, and what's your role in that? If you don't have money now, that's one thing, but if you've got the funds, at least kick in something. And so I do know that in a lot of communities, Bill's experience in New Hampshire is a very real thing. And so that I don't want to say that's a non-issue, but that's really part of why I think in all three of our cases, from Dave's around New Mexico, Todd's in Logan, and what I was hearing in Idaho, is really keeping the conversation kind of future focused and saying, what are you going to be prepared to do? What will you be wanting? And how can we make sure we're all still in partnership? Because the partnerships have to continue even if the funding levels go up or down.
Just to leverage off of what Chris has said, I totally agree, Chris. And while we don't have a funding partner that way, we have employees, we've even had board members. Some of my board members are city council members for some cities, and they're saying, hey, we didn't get the CARES money the way you did. Can we divert your CARES money for us? And I think just off of what Chris said, we do the same thing. We have a conversation about, look, that is for transit, that's related to COVID. Here's the expenses that we're incurring. Here's where we're using that. We give an accounting, if you will, of how we're using that money. And then to your point, again, thinking forward and saying, look, while the revenues may not be down for us, particularly right now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, they may be. And that's when we know that our services are even in more demand. When the unemployment rate is double digits, we need to have our services out there so people can stay employed and they can cut down their transportation costs. So I think that's a very important issue to be able to communicate.
Yes. So one more question before we wrap this up. Is there any FTA discussion about modifying performance measures based on ridership to switch to this new environment of creating safe space on buses, such as stick measures? So that could be something that I can go back to Scott about, unless you guys have anything.
This is Dave. I don't know if there's been discussion, but I know there's that blanket waiver that they're utilizing NTD data from 19 for all modes. at this point to do the formula funding for subsequent years. So that's where we're at, and I'm glad we got it because we were asking about that. And there's always, you could always be asking for a waiver for your, your own agency, but this is a blanket waiver. I think that went through about a month or two ago. So, but going into the future, I doubt it. I think they're just waiting for it to get back to normal, and they won't be modifying the performance measures. But
Right.
I'm happy with the blanket measure, the blanket.
And just to quickly underscore your point, Dave, FTA is certainly intent on keeping, using fiscal or 2019 reporting your data for another year because they recognize that this has been a really weird year. And I'll just offer my own morbid thing because I was hearing on a local radio show here in DC that Washington Metro, they're capped at 10. They're trying to maintain caps at 10 passengers per bus on their fixed route system. The way that STIC works is it's where small urban exceed large urban benchmarks. So we can all rally around, if we really want to, keeping large urban transit performance as low as possible so that we all look great in comparison. That's one way of looking at it. But seriously, I think that we'll need to look at the next authorization cycle and keep that conversation about what should be tweaked about STIC definitions and metrics alive, because I don't think anyone really knows quite how best to approach that, and it is an important question.
Indeed. So I have put the link to the coffee chat in the chat box. GMV Synchromatics is very interesting. They are involved in disinfectants, so certainly very relevant at the moment. So again, if anyone needs to contact anyone with any extra questions, all of our emails are up on this slide. So feel free to reach out to any of us or reach out to CTAA and we will find the right person for you. So I'd like to thank all of you once again for wealth of information. So there's a lot more to navigate going forward, but you guys are doing a great job, and I look forward to hearing more about your work going forward. And so I'll see everyone in the coffee chat, which is underway now. And then I will be in the NCAT technology design, service design breakout at 2:45. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.